For most of human history, people believed the world was chaotic. Storms appeared without warning, rivers flooded unexpectedly, the sky sometimes darkened in the middle of the day. But over centuries, science slowly changed that perception. Patterns were discovered. Planetary motion could be predicted centuries in advance. Weather patterns could be studied. Chemical reactions behaved in repeatable ways. The universe began to appear structured, ordered, predictable. Yet every so often, something occurs that does not seem to follow that order. Not supernatural, not magical, but strangely resistant to explanation. Events that are documented, observed by credible witnesses, sometimes even recorded in official records. And yet, they remain difficult to understand. Not because they are impossible, but because the evidence refuses to settle into a clear pattern. History contains several such moments. Moments when something happened that appears real, well documented, and deeply puzzling. One such event occurred in the early 20th century, in a quiet region of rural England. Two women took a short walk through the countryside. The path they followed was ordinary. The weather was calm. Nothing about the afternoon suggested anything unusual, but according to their account, something about the world around them suddenly changed. The landscape remained the same. The buildings remained the same. But the people they saw seemed to belong to another time, not metaphorically, literally, as if the present moment had briefly shifted. The story would later become known as the Versailles Time Slip. But it was not the only strange historical episode of its kind. There are others. Events recorded in official reports, described by multiple witnesses, investigated by historians and scientists, yet still difficult to interpret. What exactly happened during those moments? Were they misinterpretations of ordinary events, failures of perception, unusual psychological experiences, or something stranger? Something that reveals how fragile our understanding of reality can sometimes be? To explore that question, we must begin with the first documented account, a quiet afternoon in France during the summer of 1901, and two women who believed. They briefly walked through the past. The year was 1901. Europe was entering a new century. Technology was advancing rapidly. Electric lighting was spreading through major cities. Telephones were becoming more common. Scientific optimism was widespread. It was a time when many believed human knowledge was expanding faster than ever before. Yet during that same year, two visitors to France reported an experience that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Their names were Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain. Both women were respected academics. They worked at Oxford, educated, methodical, not known for sensational claims. In August of 1901, they traveled to France. During the trip, they decided to visit the gardens of Palace of Versailles. Versailles was already a famous historical site, once the residence of French kings, later associated with one of the most dramatic events in European history, the French Revolution. By the early 20th century, the palace and its surrounding gardens had become a popular destination for visitors. On the afternoon of August 10th, Moberly and Jourdain decided to explore the grounds. They were particularly interested in a small retreat located within the gardens, a building known as Petit Trianon. The Petit Trianon had once been associated with Marie Antoinette, the French queen who became one of the most recognizable figures of the revolutionary era. The two women began walking along garden paths. At first, everything seemed normal. Tourists were nearby. The grounds were quiet. The atmosphere felt peaceful. But as they moved deeper into the gardens, something began to feel unusual. Later they described a strange stillness, an unnatural silence. They noticed that the air seemed oddly heavy, almost as if the environment had changed in subtle ways. Then they saw something unexpected. Two men standing near a building. The men were wearing long green coats, clothing that looked unusual, outdated. Their hats appeared triangular, similar to 18th century military uniforms. At first, the women assumed they were staff members or perhaps historical reenactors. But something about the scene felt strange. The men gave directions, pointing toward another path. Their expressions seemed serious, almost stern. Moberly and Jourdain continued walking. Soon they reached a small bridge. Nearby, they noticed a woman sitting on the grass. She appeared to be sketching. Her clothing was elegant, old-fashioned, a wide hat, a pale dress. Later, Moberly wrote that the woman's face seemed strangely distinct, almost unnaturally clear, as if the image had been sharply illuminated. They also saw another man standing near a small building. His appearance unsettled them. His face looked dark, severe. The expression felt threatening. Both women later described an overwhelming sense of unease, but they continued toward the Petit Trianon. Eventually, they encountered a young guide who directed them toward the entrance. At that moment, the strange atmosphere disappeared. Suddenly, the gardens felt normal again. Other visitors appeared, voices returned, the sense of tension lifted. At the time, the women did not fully understand what had happened, but later, when they compared notes, they realized something disturbing. Many of the people they had seen were dressed in clothing from the late 18th century. Some of the structures they described did not exist in the gardens anymore, and the woman sketching near the lawn strongly resembled historical portraits of Marie Antoinette herself. Had they simply misunderstood ordinary events? Had actors been present in the gardens that day, or had something stranger occurred? It would take several years before the women publicly described their experience, and when they did, their account would become one of the most debated historical anomalies ever recorded. When unusual historical accounts appear, scholars usually begin with the simplest explanations: memory errors, misinterpretations, incomplete information. The Versailles Incident was no exception. Historians examined the timeline carefully. They asked basic questions first. Were there historical reenactments happening that day? Could the women have encountered actors wearing 18th century clothing? Records suggest that no such event was scheduled. Another explanation involved simple confusion. The gardens of Versailles are large. Paths branch in many directions. Visitors can easily become disoriented. Perhaps the women misunderstood what they were seeing. Tour guides sometimes wear costumes. Garden staff may wear uniforms. Under certain conditions, clothing can appear older than it really is. Psychologists also considered memory distortion. The women did not write down their full account immediately. Their descriptions were reconstructed later. Human memory is not a perfect recording device. Memories shift over time. Details can become sharper or fade, especially when two people discuss the same event repeatedly. One person's recollection can influence the other's. Over time, a shared narrative may form, a narrative that feels extremely convincing, even if parts of it were gradually reconstructed. Another explanation focused on perception. The human brain constantly interprets incomplete information. We fill gaps automatically. Faces are recognized even in shadows. Patterns appear in random shapes. Sometimes the brain interprets unfamiliar stimuli using familiar historical images. For example, if someone sees unusual clothing in a historical location, the mind may subconsciously associate it with figures from that location's past. Marie Antoinette is strongly associated with Versailles. Her image appears in paintings, books, museum displays. If the brain encountered someone wearing a pale dress and a large hat, it might briefly connect that image with the famous queen, not intentionally, but automatically. There was also another theory: environmental psychology. Some researchers suggested that the women may have entered a particularly quiet section of the gardens, where sound was dampened, where lighting conditions were unusual. The resulting atmosphere might have created a strong emotional impression, one that felt strange enough to distort perception. These explanations were not supernatural. They relied on well-known psychological mechanisms. But even with these theories, some details remain difficult to resolve, because the two women reported many very specific observations that seemed oddly precise, and those details would later create new questions. Several years after the event, Moberly and Jourdain decided to investigate their own experience. They began studying the history of Versailles in greater detail, looking for explanations, looking for confirmation. What they discovered was surprising. Some of the structures they described had existed in the 18th century, but were no longer present in 1901. One example involved a small bridge. Historical maps suggested that such a bridge had once been located in that exact area of the gardens, but it had been removed long before their visit. They also described a building with specific architectural features that matched historical illustrations from the period of Marie Antoinette. Another detail involved the clothing worn by the men in green coats. Historians later noted that similar uniforms had been used by palace guards in the late 18th century. Individually, these details might have been coincidence, but together, they created a pattern that intrigued researchers. Critics argued that the women could have learned these details later, perhaps while researching Versailles history. Memory reconstruction might then have blended those historical facts into their recollection. Supporters of the time slip interpretation suggested something else. They proposed that the women might have experienced a brief overlap of historical perception, a moment when the past and present seemed to intersect, not physically, but perceptually. Most scientists rejected that idea, not because it was impossible, but because there was no known mechanism that could produce such an effect. Physics does not allow people to see into the past. Time moves in one direction. Information cannot travel backward through time in the way the story implies. Still, the Versailles incident remains unusual, because it was reported by two educated observers, because it involved detailed descriptions, and because certain historical details seemed unexpectedly accurate. But the story of unexplained historical perception does not end at Versailles. Another event, far older, would raise similar questions. This time, not in a royal garden, but in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of years. At this point, the story begins to shift from quiet gardens in France to an abandoned ship drifting across the Atlantic Ocean, a second historical mystery, one that has puzzled investigators for more than a century. But to understand that event, we must follow the evidence carefully. We will continue that investigation in part 2 of this documentary. If you want to see what happened next, continue with part 2.